You think you're a hero? My brother Jake sneered at me across our father's casket, his voice cutting through the hushed conversations of the funeral reception. The entire room fell silent. 200 people from Millfield, Texas, all staring as I stood there in my dress blues, 4 deployment patches visible on my sleeve, facing down the golden boy who'd never left home. What I said next shattered 28 years of family lies and exposed secrets that would destroy everything Jake thought he knew about being Dad's favorite son. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, and if you're watching this, prepare yourself for a story about sacrifice, betrayal, and how sometimes the people closest to you are the ones working hardest to tear you down. Have you ever served your country with honor, only to come home and discover your own family has been sabotaging your reputation for years? Have you ever been painted as the family disappointment while the real villain wore a halo in everyone else's eyes? Because that's exactly what happened to me at Riverside Memorial Chapel on November 8, 2023, during my father's funeral. And what came next? The confrontation, the revelations, the complete destruction of the perfect family narrative my brother had spent decades constructing. That's what finally set the record straight after a lifetime of lies. But let me take you back to the beginning of that devastating day, because understanding what led to that moment requires knowing who my father really was, what my military service had cost me, and why Jake had every reason to fear what I might say if I ever decided to stop being the silent, dutiful daughter. Master Sergeant Daniel Mitchell died of a heart attack at 62, alone in his workshop behind our family home in Millfield. I was stationed at Fort Bragg when I got the call from Jake, his voice artificially calm in the way it got when he was delivering bad news but trying to control the narrative. "Dad's gone, Sarah. Heart attack. Happened this morning while he was working on that old Chevy. Mom found him around noon." I was on a plane within hours, my commanding officer granting me emergency leave without hesitation. During the 3-hour flight from North Carolina to Texas, I stared out the window and tried to process the reality that my father, the man who'd inspired my military career, who taught me about honor and service and doing what's right even when it's hard, was gone. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dad had been Army through and through. 2 tours in Vietnam, 22 years of active duty, retiring as a master sergeant with a chest full of ribbons and the kind of quiet pride that didn't need to announce itself. He'd never pushed me toward the military, but when I announced at 18 that I was enlisting, his smile told me everything I needed to know about his approval. "The military family serves," was all he said, but I carried those words through basic training, officer candidate school, and 4 deployments across Iraq and Afghanistan. Jake had been 17 when I enlisted, and he'd made his position clear from the beginning. Why would you want to go play soldier when you could stay here and build something real? He was referring to Mitchell Hardware, the family business that Dad had started after retiring from the Army. Jake had always assumed he'd inherit it, despite never showing much interest in actually working there during high school. When I arrived in Millfield, the divide was immediately apparent. Jake had taken charge of all the funeral arrangements, presenting himself as the grieving son who'd stayed home to care for their aging parents. I was the daughter who'd chosen the military over family, who visited twice a year and sent money instead of spending time. The narrative was familiar because Jake had been crafting it for a decade. Our mother, Patricia, had never fully recovered from a stroke 3 years earlier. Her speech was limited, her mobility restricted, and she required full-time care that Jake had somehow positioned himself as providing, despite the fact that I'd been sending $2,000 a month to cover professional home health services. But Jake had always been gifted at making himself the hero of every story. "Sarah, thank God you're here," he said when I arrived at the house, embracing me in front of the neighbors who'd gathered to offer condolences. "I've been trying to handle everything, but you know how Dad would have wanted his military daughter involved in the planning." It sounded supportive, even loving, but I caught the subtle dig. his military daughter, as if my service was some kind of hobby rather than a 20-year career. Jake had perfected the art of undermining me while appearing generous and inclusive. The funeral planning revealed more of the same dynamic. Jake had already selected the funeral home, chosen the casket, written the obituary, and arranged for a service at the Methodist church where our family had attended when I was growing up. Everything was tasteful, appropriate, and completely controlled by Jake's vision of what the community expected. "I thought we'd have a military honor guard," I suggested during one planning session. "Dad would have appreciated that." "Oh, I already looked into it," Jake replied smoothly. "But they said it would take weeks to arrange, and we can't wait that long. Besides, I think Dad would have preferred something more intimate, more focused on family." Later, I called the honor guard coordinator myself and discovered that military honors could be arranged with 48 hours' notice. Jake had never contacted them at all. It was a small thing, but it fit the pattern I'd been noticing for years. Jake presenting obstacles as insurmountable while positioning himself as the reasonable, practical one. The obituary was another example. Jake had written it without consulting me, and when I finally saw it in the Millfield Gazette, I was shocked by what he'd chosen to emphasize and what he'd omitted entirely. Daniel Mitchell, 62, passed away peacefully at his home in Millfield. He is survived by his devoted wife Patricia and his son Jake, who worked alongside Daniel in the family hardware business for over 10 years. He is also survived by his daughter Sarah, who serves in the military. Daniel will be remembered for his dedication to his community and his pride in the family business he built from nothing. No mention of Dad's military service, no reference to his Vietnam tours or his 22 years of active duty, no acknowledgement of my rank or my 4 deployments. I was simply his daughter who serves in the military, while Jake was his son who worked alongside Daniel in the family hardware business. When I pointed this out to Jake, he shrugged dismissively. "I had limited word count, Sarah. I focused on what was most relevant to the people who knew him here in Millfield. His military service wasn't relevant? Look, we all know you're proud of your career, but Dad's been out of the Army for 25 years. The hardware store is what people remember him for." But that wasn't true, and Jake knew it. Dad had been active in the local VFW chapter, had mentored young veterans transitioning to civilian life, and had never stopped identifying himself as a soldier first. His Army service wasn't ancient history, it was the foundation of everything he'd built afterward. The viewing was scheduled for Tuesday evening, with the funeral service Wednesday morning. I arrived at the funeral home early, wanting some private time with Dad before the crowds arrived. That's when I saw the display Jake had created, a memorial table with photos and mementos representing Dad's life. There were pictures of Jake and Dad at hardware store events, Jake receiving his high school diploma, Jake's wedding 5 years earlier. There were photos of Dad's workshop, his fishing trips, community barbecues. But there wasn't a single photograph of Dad in uniform, no military memorabilia, nothing that acknowledged the career that had shaped him into the man everyone claimed to respect. I found Jake setting up flower arrangements and confronted him about the display. Where are the military photos, Dad's medals, his deployment certificates? Jake looked uncomfortable for the first time since I'd arrived. "I couldn't find them. Mom doesn't remember where Dad kept that stuff, and I've been too busy with the arrangements to go through all his boxes." But I knew exactly where Dad kept his military memorabilia, in the cedar chest in his bedroom, the same place they'd been stored for my entire life. Jake's claim that he couldn't find them was an outright lie, which meant their absence was deliberate. I drove to the house and retrieved the items myself. Dad's Bronze Star, his Purple Heart, photos from Vietnam, his retirement ceremony pictures, the flag that had flown over his base on his final day of service. I brought everything back to the funeral home and added it to the memorial display, ignoring Jake's obvious annoyance. People are going to think this is too much military stuff. People are going to know who he really was. The viewing that evening drew a huge crowd, easily 300 people passing through to pay their respects. I stood beside the casket in my dress blues, accepting condolences and sharing stories about Dad's service with the many veterans who attended.
It was clear that the military community had loved and respected my father, that his service remained an important part of his identity right up until his death. Jake worked the other side of the room, playing the role of the devoted son who'd sacrificed his own opportunities to care for aging parents and maintain the family business. I watched him accept sympathy and praise for his dedication, positioning himself as the responsible child, while I was implicitly cast as the one who'd chosen career over family. But it was the conversation I overheard near the end of the evening that really opened my eyes to how deep Jake's manipulation had gone. Mrs. Henderson, who lived next door to our family home, was talking to a group of church ladies near the memorial table. Jake's been a blessing to Patricia and Daniel, taking care of the business, managing Patricia's care, handling all the financial responsibilities. Sarah's done well for herself in the military, of course, but Jake's the one who's been here when they've needed him. It must be hard for him, taking care of everything while his sister's off playing soldier. Playing soldier. The phrase hit me like a physical blow, not just because of the disrespect to my service, but because of how it revealed the narrative Jake had been spreading about me in the community. I was the daughter who had abandoned her family to play soldier, while Jake was the dutiful son making sacrifices for the greater good. I realized that Jake hadn't just been controlling the funeral arrangements, he'd been controlling the story of our entire family for years, painting himself as the responsible, caring son, while subtly undermining my military career and suggesting that I'd chosen personal ambition over family loyalty. The funeral service the next morning was everything Jake had planned. Dignified, respectful, focused on Dad's role as a community member and family man. The pastor delivered a eulogy that barely mentioned Dad's military service, instead emphasizing his work at the hardware store and his devotion to his family. I sat in the front row, surrounded by relatives and family friends, listening to a version of my father's life that felt sanitized and incomplete. This wasn't the man who taught me about honor and service, who'd shared stories of his deployments, who had been proud of my Bronze Star than any business achievement. This was Jake's version of Dad, the small-town businessman who'd moved on from his military past.
After the service, we moved to the church fellowship hall for the reception. That's where everything fell apart, where 28 years of Jake's carefully constructed narrative finally collided with the truth I could no longer stay silent about. I was standing near the memorial table, talking with some of Dad's old Army buddies, when Jake approached with a plate of food and that familiar expression of barely concealed irritation. "Sarah, maybe you could tone down the military talk a little. This is supposed to be a celebration of Dad's whole life, not just his Army years." Colonel Peterson, who'd served with Dad in Vietnam, looked surprised. "Your father was prouder of his service than anything else in his life, son. It's what made him the man he became." Jake's jaw tightened. "With respect, Colonel, you didn't know him the last 25 years. Dad moved on from all that. He was focused on building something for his family, creating a legacy that would last." "You mean the hardware store?" I asked quietly. "I mean the business that put food on our table and paid for your college education, the business that's been supporting this family while you've been off playing soldier in foreign countries." The words hung in the air like a slap. Playing soldier. The same phrase I'd heard Mrs. Henderson use the night before, and now I understood where it had come from. This wasn't just Jake's momentary frustration. This was how he'd been describing my military career to anyone who would listen. Colonel Peterson's face hardened. "Son, your sister has served 4 combat tours and earned more commendations than most soldiers see in a lifetime. That's not playing, that's sacrifice." Jake laughed, a bitter sound that carried across the fellowship hall and drew attention from nearby conversations. Sacrifice? She volunteered for those deployments. She chose to leave her family behind every chance she got. Meanwhile, I've been here taking care of Mom and Dad, running the business, handling all the real responsibilities. The real responsibilities? My voice was louder now, carrying across the increasingly quiet room. "You mean the $24,000 a year I've been sending home to pay for Mom's care?
The real responsibilities like the GI Bill benefits I transferred to you so you could finish college? The real responsibilities like the VA loan I co-signed so you could buy your house? Jake's face went white, but he pressed on, apparently committed to this confrontation regardless of the audience. Money doesn't make up for being here, Sarah. Dad needed his family around him, not checks in the mail from someone too busy with her own career to come home. That's when I snapped. 20 years of deployment cycles, missed holidays, and delayed personal plans so I could serve my country, while Jake stayed home and built his reputation as the devoted son. 20 years of sending money, making sacrifices, and supporting my family from a distance, only to be characterized as selfish and self-serving. You think you're a hero? Jake continued, his voice rising to match mine. You think wearing that uniform makes you better than the rest of us? Dad was embarrassed by your need to prove yourself. He told me he wished you'd grown out of playing soldier and come home to do something meaningful with your life. The fellowship hall went completely silent. 200 people, including Dad's military friends, church congregation, and community leaders, all staring at us across the memorial table. Jake had crossed a line he couldn't uncross, said something so cruel and so false that it demanded a response. And in that moment of perfect silence, surrounded by everything Jake had built his reputation on, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done protecting Jake's image, done allowing him to diminish my service while positioning himself as the family hero, done letting him control the narrative about who our father really was and what he'd valued most in life. What I said next would shatter Jake's carefully constructed world and reveal truths about our family that he'd been hiding for years. Because while Jake had been building his reputation as the devoted son, I'd been quietly discovering evidence of betrayals that went far deeper than sibling rivalry or career jealousy. The truth about why I'd really chosen 4 combat deployments. The truth about what Jake had been doing with the family business finances. The truth about Dad's final months and the conversations Jake had made sure I never heard. And most devastating of all, the truth about Dad's will and the inheritance Jake had been planning to claim while painting me as the daughter who had abandoned her family. Standing there in my dress blues, surrounded by people who'd known me since childhood, I realized this wasn't just about defending my military service or honoring Dad's memory. This was about exposing years of manipulation, financial betrayal, and systematic character assassination that had been designed to make Jake look like a saint while destroying my relationship with my family. The trajectory Jake had put us on with his public humiliation was about to lead somewhere he never expected, and everyone in that fellowship hall was about to learn who the real hero of the Mitchell family had been all along. What Jake didn't understand as he stood there in that fellowship hall, destroying my reputation in front of our entire community, was that I'd been documenting his lies for 3 years. Every forged signature on Mom's care facility checks, every unauthorized withdrawal from Dad's business account, every time he'd used my power of attorney to make decisions that benefited him while telling everyone I was too busy with my military career to care about family. But let me take you back to how it all started, because understanding why Jake felt safe enough to publicly humiliate me requires knowing the web of deception he'd been weaving since the day I left for basic training.
When I enlisted in 2003 at 18, Jake was a junior in high school with mediocre grades and no clear direction. He'd always been the charming one, the social butterfly who could talk his way out of trouble and make adults believe he was more responsible than he actually was. Dad saw through it, but Mom had always babied Jake, making excuses for his failures and celebrating his minor achievements like they were major accomplishments. "Sarah's the driven one," I'd heard Mom tell neighbors countless times. "Jake's more laid back, more family-oriented. He'll probably stay close to home and take care of us when we're old." Even then, at 17, I recognized the manipulation. Jake wasn't family-oriented. He was lazy and opportunistic. He'd figured out that positioning himself as the devoted son who'd sacrifice his own ambitions for family created a perfect excuse for underachievement while making me look selfish for pursuing my own goals. But Dad saw it differently. "Jake needs to find his own way,"
he'd told me privately before I left for Fort Benning. "He's been coasting on charm and your mother's protection. Maybe you setting an example will help him figure out what he wants to do with his life." What Jake figured out was how to leverage my absence. During my first deployment to Iraq in 2005, Jake was supposed to be finishing his senior year and preparing for college. Instead, he was using my deployment as justification for staying home to help with the family business and support mom while dad was worried about Sarah being in danger. The narrative was brilliant in its simplicity. Jake was sacrificing his own opportunities to hold the family together while his sister was off fighting in foreign wars. It made him look noble and me look selfish, even though I was the one dodging IEDs and sending half my combat pay home to help with expenses. When I came home on leave in 2006, I found Jake firmly entrenched in the hardware store, talking knowledgeably about inventory and suppliers like he'd been running the business for years instead of months. Dad seemed pleased that Jake was finally showing interest in something productive, but I noticed things that bothered me. Jake had convinced Dad to give him a company credit card for emergency purchases. He'd moved into Dad's office space, claiming he needed somewhere quiet to do paperwork. Most concerning, he'd started sitting in on Dad's meetings with the accountant and bank representatives, positioning himself as the heir apparent to a business he'd shown zero interest in throughout high school. "I'm proud of Jake for stepping up," Dad told me during that leave. "He's really matured while you've been gone." But Jake hadn't matured. He'd gotten better at manipulation. During family dinners, he'd steer conversations toward the challenges of running a small business, the stress of managing employees, the complexities of dealing with suppliers. He'd present problems and solutions in ways that made him appear indispensable, while subtly emphasizing how my military career kept me from understanding or contributing to real family responsibilities. When I returned to Iraq for my second deployment in 2007, Jake escalated his strategy. He convinced Dad to make him an official partner in Mitchell Hardware, arguing that the business needed stability and continuity that couldn't depend on whether I decided to make the Army a career. "Sarah might stay in the military for 20 years, Jake had argued, according to Dad's letters. "The business can't wait for decisions that might never come. We need someone committed to being here long term." Jake also convinced Dad to set up a special power of attorney, giving him authority to make financial decisions for Mom if Dad was ever unavailable. "Just as a precaution," Jake had explained, "in case something happens to you and Sarah's deployed somewhere she can't get home quickly." I was concerned about these changes, but every time I raised questions during phone calls home, I was told I was overthinking things or being paranoid because of combat stress. Jake had done an excellent job of framing any criticism of his expanding role as evidence that military service was making me suspicious and difficult. The pattern continued through my third deployment in 2009 and fourth in 2012. Each time I came home on leave, Jake had consolidated more control over family finances and business operations. Each time I expressed concerns, I was told I didn't understand the situation because I wasn't there dealing with day-to-day realities. By 2015, when I returned from my final deployment and transitioned to a stateside assignment, Jake had effectively taken over Mitchell Hardware. Dad was still nominally in charge, but Jake controlled the books, made purchasing decisions, handled employee scheduling, and managed all banking relationships. He'd also convinced Dad to take out a substantial business loan to modernize operations and expand inventory. What I discovered later was that very little of that loan money had actually gone into business improvements. Instead, Jake had used it to fund a lifestyle that far exceeded what a small-town hardware store could support. The new truck, the expensive fishing boat, the hunting lease, the European vacation he'd taken with his wife. All of it financed through business loans that were slowly strangling Mitchell Hardware's cash flow. But Jake had gotten very good at hiding financial problems while maintaining appearances. When business was slow, he'd blame the economy or competition from big box stores. When cash flow was tight, he'd point to seasonal fluctuations or the need to carry more inventory. He always had explanations that sounded reasonable to someone who wasn't looking at the books carefully. Dad, who had built the business from nothing over 25 years, trusted Jake completely. He'd stepped back from day-to-day operations, content.
But Jake wasn't actually providing mom's care. He'd hired professional nurses and therapists, paid for with money I was sending home specifically for that purpose. What Jake was providing was control. He filtered all information going to and from mom, decided who could visit and when, and managed her finances through the power of attorney Dad had helped him establish years earlier. I tried to visit mom regularly during my stateside assignments, but Jake made it difficult. There were always scheduling conflicts, medical appointments, therapy sessions, or family obligations that interfered with my visits. When I did manage to see mom, Jake was always present, managing the conversation and interpreting her limited speech in ways that supported his narrative about family dynamics. "Mom's been worried about your next deployment," Jake would say, even though I'd already transitioned out of deployable status. "She wishes you could find a way to stay closer to home." Or, "Mom was saying she appreciates the money you send, but what she really wants is more time with her daughter." These weren't mom's words. Mom's speech was too limited for complex sentences. These were Jake's interpretations, designed to make me feel guilty about my military career and reinforce the narrative that I was choosing service over family. The financial manipulation became more sophisticated as Jake gained experience and confidence. He learned to forge signatures well enough to fool bank tellers and insurance representatives. He'd figured out how to access accounts through online banking and move money in ways that wouldn't trigger automatic alerts. He'd become skilled at creating paper trails that supported his version of events while hiding evidence of his actual activities. Most cleverly, Jake had learned to use my military career as cover for his schemes. When questions arose about unusual financial transactions or missing funds, Jake would explain that I'd authorized them during phone calls or video chats for my base assignments. He'd claim that I preferred to handle financial matters remotely because I was too busy with military responsibilities to deal with details in person. "Sarah's handling this through her end," Jake would tell bank representatives or insurance agents. "She's got power of attorney for business matters, and it's easier for her to coordinate everything from her base." But I'd never been given power of attorney for business matters. Jake had forged those documents, along with dozens of others over the years, using my signature from legitimate paperwork I'd signed during visits home. The scope of Jake's deception became clear in 2019 when Dad started having health problems, and I began paying closer attention to family finances. What I discovered made me physically sick. Jake had taken out multiple loans against the business, the family home, and even Mom's life insurance policy. He'd established credit cards in Mom's name and run up balances she knew nothing about. He'd been systematically transferring money from Dad's retirement accounts into business accounts he controlled, claiming the transfers were necessary to keep Mitchell Hardware operating. Most devastating of all, Jake had convinced Dad to change his will in 2017 during a period when I was focused on a demanding assignment at the Pentagon. The new will left the hardware store entirely to Jake with a token financial inheritance for me. Dad had been told this was necessary because I had my military pension and Jake needed the business to support his family. But Jake had lied about my financial situation. He'd told Dad that military officers made much more money than we actually did, that I had substantial savings from my deployments, and that I'd specifically told him I didn't want to be burdened with running a small-town business. "Sarah said she's not interested in the store," Jake had reported to Dad. "She wants to focus on her military career and doesn't have time for business responsibilities." I'd never said anything of the kind. In fact, I'd always assumed I'd return to Millfield after retirement and help Dad transition the business to the next generation. We'd talked about it during my childhood, and Dad had always spoken about when you come home to help me run things. But Jake had erased those conversations from Dad's memory, rewriting our family history to position himself as the son who'd sacrificed everything for family, while I was the daughter who'd chosen career over responsibility. The most heartbreaking discovery was a series of letters Dad had written but never sent, expressing his disappointment in my choices and his gratitude for Jake's dedication.
Jake had been feeding Dad information about my selfishness and lack of family loyalty for years, slowly poisoning their relationship while presenting himself as the interpreter of my motivations and feelings. Sarah doesn't call as much as she used to, one letter read. She's too busy with her military friends to make time for family. I'm proud of her service, but I wish she cared more about the people who raised her. Dad had never expressed these feelings to me directly because Jake had convinced him that I was too proud and defensive to hear criticism. Instead, Dad had internalized his manufactured disappointment while Jake basked in the role of devoted son who understood family values. When I discovered these letters in Dad's workshop after his death, I finally understood the full scope of Jake's manipulation. It wasn't just financial fraud or identity theft. It was systematic psychological warfare designed to destroy my relationship with my parents while elevating Jake's status as the perfect son. Jake had spent 15 years turning my military career, the thing I was most proud of, the career Dad had always supported, into evidence of selfishness and family abandonment. He'd used my physical absence during deployments to rewrite history, forge documents, and create a narrative where every sacrifice I'd made for my country was actually a betrayal of my family. And it had worked perfectly until Dad's death forced everything into the open. Jake had gotten comfortable with his lies, confident that he controlled all the information sources and could continue manipulating the truth indefinitely.
What he didn't know was that I'd been conducting my own investigation for 3 years, gathering evidence and documenting his crimes. Every forged signature, every unauthorized transaction, every lie he'd told about my wishes or intentions, I had proof of all of it. Standing in that fellowship hall, listening to Jake destroy my reputation in front of our entire community, I realized that his public attack wasn't just cruel, it was strategic. He was trying to preemptively discredit me because he knew I'd discovered his schemes and he was afraid of what I might reveal. But Jake had miscalculated. He'd pushed too far, said too much, revealed too much of his true attitude toward my service and sacrifice. He'd given me the perfect opening to expose 15 years of lies and manipulation, and he'd done it in front of 200 witnesses who could never claim they hadn't heard the truth. The devoted son who'd sacrificed everything for family was about to be revealed as a criminal who'd stolen everything from family. And the daughter who'd supposedly abandoned her responsibilities was about to prove that she'd been the only one actually protecting the family all along. Jake thought he was delivering the final blow to my reputation. What he was actually doing was handing me the evidence I needed to destroy his. The silence in the fellowship hall stretched for what felt like an eternity. 200 people waiting to see how I would respond to Jake's public character assassination. What they got wasn't the defensive explanation or emotional breakdown Jake was expecting. What they got was 3 years of carefully documented evidence delivered with the precision of a military briefing. "You want to talk about sacrifice, Jake?" I said, my voice carrying across the silent room. "Let's talk about the $186,000 I've sent home over the past 15 years. The money you told everyone came from Dad's business profits." Jake's confident expression flickered. "Sarah, this isn't the time or place. Let's talk about the GI Bill benefits I transferred to you in 2006, worth $45,000 so you could finish college. The college you've been claiming you paid for yourself while working at the hardware store." The murmur that rippled through the crowd told me people were starting to pay attention to details they'd never heard before. Jake's face was getting red, but he couldn't stop me without confirming that everything I was saying was true. "Let's talk about the VA home loan I co-signed for you in 2010, enabling you to buy that house you're so proud of. The house you told everyone you saved up for through years of hard work and sacrifice." Mrs. Henderson, who'd been praising Jake's financial responsibility just days earlier, was staring at him with a confused expression. Colonel Peterson had his arms crossed, watching Jake with the kind of attention career military officers reserved for people they suspected of lying. But I wasn't finished. I pulled out my phone and opened the folder I'd labeled Jake's Crimes.
3 years of screenshots, photos, and recorded conversations that documented every aspect of his systematic theft and manipulation. Jake, should I tell them about the business loan you took out in March 2019? The $85,000 you claimed was for inventory expansion, but actually used to pay for your fishing boat and hunting lease? You don't know what you're talking about, Jake said, but his voice lacked conviction. The business needed capital investments. I have the bank records, I interrupted, holding up my phone. Loan disbursement on March 15th, boat purchase on March 18th, hunting lease payment on March 22nd. Should I show everyone the receipts? The fellowship hall was completely silent now. Every conversation stopped. Every eye focused on our confrontation. Jake was trapped between continuing to lie and admitting to fraud, neither option offering him an escape route. Or maybe we should discuss Mom's care facility payments. The $2,000 a month I've been sending since her stroke, money you told the bank came from Dad's business profits when you applied for the line of credit increase. Jake's wife, Amanda, who'd been standing supportively beside him throughout the funeral events, took a step back. I could see the recognition dawning in her eyes as she started connecting financial details that had never quite added up in their household. Sarah, Jake, you're misunderstanding legitimate business transactions. Dad approved all of these arrangements. Did Dad approve you forging his signature on the loan modification documents in 2020? Because I have copies of both his real signature and your forgeries. Would you like me to show everyone the difference? That's when panic flashed across Jake's face. He'd gotten sloppy during Dad's final illness when Dad was too weak to review paperwork carefully and Mom was too impaired to notice financial irregularities. Jake had been forging signatures with confidence, never imagining that anyone was documenting his crimes. But I'd been photographing every piece of suspicious paperwork I'd found during my visits home: bank statements, loan documents, insurance claims, power of attorney forms. Everything Jake thought he'd hidden was documented in my phone, ready to be uploaded to federal law enforcement databases the moment I pressed send. The most interesting document, I continued, was the will modification you convinced Dad to sign in 2017, the one where you told him I'd specifically said I didn't want any part of the family business. A collective gasp arose from the crowd. In small communities, inheritance disputes were serious matters, and everyone knew that Dad had built Mitchell Hardware from nothing. The idea that he'd deliberately cut his daughter out of his life's work was shocking to people who'd known our family for decades. Jake told Dad that I was making too much money in the military to need an inheritance, that I'd specifically requested to be excluded from business ownership. But I have recordings of our actual conversations, Jake. Would you like me to play them? Recordings? Jake's voice cracked. Every phone call we've had for the past 3 years, perfectly legal under Texas single-party consent laws, including the call where you admitted you'd been managing Dad's perceptions about my career and family commitments.
Jake looked like he was going to be sick. He'd confessed to manipulating Dad during a phone conversation in 2021, thinking he was safely sharing his strategic insights with a sister who would never have evidence to contradict his narrative. But the most devastating revelation was still coming. The real tragedy, Jake, is what you did to Dad in his final months. The medication changes you made without consulting his doctors. The isolation you enforced when he started asking questions about missing money. I was protecting him from stress. You were protecting yourself from exposure. Dad called me 6 weeks before he died, Jake. He'd found discrepancies in the business accounts and wanted my help reviewing the finances. Do you remember what you told him when he mentioned that call? Jake's silence was answer enough. You told him I was too busy with military obligations to deal with family problems. You convinced him that I'd brushed off his concerns and didn't care about the business struggles. But I have the recording of that call, Jake. Dad wasn't calling about business problems. He was calling because he'd discovered you'd been stealing from him for years. The fellowship hall erupted in shocked conversations.
People were looking at Jake with expressions ranging from confusion to disgust. The perfect image of the devoted son cracking apart in real time. But I wasn't finished destroying Jake's reputation. The most damning evidence was still coming. Dad didn't die of a heart attack from natural causes, Jake. He died of a heart attack brought on by the stress of discovering that his trusted son had been systematically robbing him blind. The medication changes you made, switching his blood pressure prescription to a generic that didn't work as effectively, those changes contributed to his death. You can't prove that, Jake said desperately. Actually, I can. I have Dad's medical records, the prescription changes you authorized, and the correlation between his declining health and his growing awareness of your crimes. I also have the recording of your conversation with Dr. Martinez, where you specifically requested medications that would keep Dad calm and less focused on business details. Amanda was staring at her husband like she'd never seen him before. Several people in the crowd were pulling out their phones, presumably to text family members about the shocking revelations unfolding at what should have been a peaceful funeral reception. Pastor Williams, who delivered Dad's eulogy that morning, approached our confrontation with obvious concern. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation in private," he suggested diplomatically. "No," I said firmly. Jake made this public when he decided to humiliate my military service in front of everyone who knew Dad. If he wants to question my honor and sacrifice, then everyone gets to hear the truth about his. I turned back to Jake, who looked like he was desperately calculating escape routes. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit is very interested in your activities, Jake, especially when they involve identity theft, elder abuse, and fraud against veterans' benefits. Agent Carolina Vega from the Dallas field office will be contacting you early next week. Jake's knees actually buckled at the mention of federal law enforcement. He grabbed a chair for support, his confident facade completely shattered. "You called the FBI?" Amanda whispered. "I called the FBI, the Texas Attorney General's Elder Abuse Division, the VA Inspector General's Office, and the IRS. Jake's been committing federal crimes for over a decade, including stealing money that was specifically designated for veterans' care and family support." The crowd was buzzing with shocked conversations now, people trying to process the magnitude of what they were hearing. Jake Mitchell, the man they'd admired as a devoted son and responsible businessman, was apparently a sophisticated criminal who'd been stealing from his own family for years. Colonel Peterson stepped forward, his expression grim. "Sarah, are you saying Jake defrauded veterans' benefits?" "I'm saying Jake diverted money I sent home specifically for Dad's care, Mom's medical expenses, and family support. Money that was exempt from taxation because of its designation as family care assistance. When Jake used that money for personal purchases and business fraud, he committed federal crimes against veterans' benefits." Jake tried one last desperate strategy. "She's lying," he announced to the crowd. "Sarah's been planning this for months, trying to destroy my reputation because she's jealous of my relationship with Dad. This is all revenge because she couldn't accept that Dad loved the son who stayed home more than the daughter who left." But his words fell flat. Too many people had heard too many specific details, seen too much evidence, watched Jake's reactions to each accusation. His credibility was destroyed, and everyone in the room knew it. More importantly, several people in the crowd were veterans who understood exactly what kind of crimes I was describing. They knew that defrauding veterans' benefits was serious federal business, and they were looking at Jake with the kind of contempt reserved for people who steal from those who've served. The funeral home director called me yesterday because Jake tried to have Dad cremated without military honors. He didn't want a flag ceremony or 21-gun salute because he was afraid the military attention would lead to questions about family finances. Mrs. Foster, who'd praised Jake's devotion just days earlier, shook her head in disbelief. "Jake, is this true? Did you try to deny your father military honors?" Jake couldn't answer. Every defense he offered would require admitting to some aspect of the crimes I exposed.
He was trapped in a web of lies that was collapsing under the weight of documented evidence. But the most pathetic part is that Jake thought he'd gotten away with it. He thought Dad's death would end any questions about missing money or forged documents. He was planning to sell the hardware store, claim the insurance money, and move somewhere nobody knew about his crimes.
Amanda stared at her husband. Is that why you've been talking about relocating? You said it was for better business opportunities. I have emails, I interrupted, between Jake and a real estate agent in Colorado. Plans to liquidate Dad's assets and disappear with the proceeds, including Mom's life insurance policy, which Jake increased to $200,000 last year without her knowledge or consent. The final piece of evidence was the one that would destroy Jake's life completely. I'd saved it for last because once I revealed it, there would be no possibility of redemption or reconciliation. Jake's been slowly poisoning Mom. The words hit the fellowship hall like a bomb. People gasped, someone screamed, and Amanda actually stepped away from her husband in horror. Her medication errors, the incidents where she seemed confused or disoriented, Jake's been tampering with her prescriptions. Not enough to kill her quickly, but enough to accelerate her decline and justify moving her to a more expensive care facility where he could control her environment completely. That's insane, Jake said, but his voice was shaking. I've been taking care of Mom. You've been positioning yourself to inherit her estate while systematically destroying her health. I have samples of her medications that show chemical inconsistencies. The state health department is launching a full investigation. Jake collapsed into a chair, his face gray with shock. Around us, the fellowship hall was in chaos as people tried to process the magnitude of what they'd heard. The devoted son who'd sacrificed everything for family was actually a calculated predator who'd been systematically destroying the family he claimed to love. But I had one final revelation that would ensure Jake faced the maximum possible consequences for his crimes. The recordings I mentioned earlier, the ones where Jake admitted to manipulating Dad and managing family perceptions, those recordings also captured Jake bragging about how easy it was to fool everyone, how stupid our parents were for trusting him, and how much he looked forward to inheriting everything after they died. Jake's head snapped up, his eyes wide with terror. He'd forgotten about those conversations, the moments when he'd been so confident in his success that he'd shared his true feelings about the family he was betraying. Agent Vega is particularly interested in the recording where you laughed about Dad's heart attack and said it saved you from having to find a more permanent solution to the old man problem. The fellowship hall went completely silent. People were staring at Jake with horror, understanding that they'd been listening to evidence of not just theft and fraud, but potential murder. Jake tried to stand, stumbled, and sat back down heavily. His perfect life, built on 15 years of lies and manipulation, was crumbling in real time in front of everyone who'd ever respected or admired him. "The funeral's over, Jake," I said quietly, "but your reckoning is just beginning." As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text from Agent Vega. "Arrest warrants approved. Team en route to funeral location. ETA 15 minutes. I looked at Jake, who was staring at me with something between hatred and grudging respect. He'd underestimated his military sister one final time, and this mistake would cost him everything. "You wanted to know if I think I'm a hero," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I don't. I'm just a soldier who protects her family from predators, even when those predators wear familiar faces." The sound of approaching sirens began echoing across Millfield, growing louder as federal agents closed in on the man who'd spent 15 years betraying everyone who'd ever trusted him. Jake's war against my honor and service was about to end with his complete destruction, and everyone who'd witnessed his public humiliation would remember exactly how it happened. The FBI tactical team arrived at Riverside Methodist Church exactly 15 minutes after my text alert, their black SUVs creating a surreal contrast against the small-town funeral setting. Agent Carolina Vega led the team through the fellowship hall doors, just as Jake was trying to convince Amanda and the remaining crowd that I was suffering from some kind of military-related mental breakdown. "Agent Jacob Mitchell," Agent Vega announced, her voice carrying the authority of 15 years in federal law enforcement. You're under arrest for bank fraud, wire fraud, elder abuse, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit murder." The room erupted in chaos, but it was a different kind of chaos than Jake's public humiliation had created. This was the chaos of people witnessing history, watching a federal arrest happen in their church fellowship hall during what should have been a peaceful funeral reception. Jake's face went from gray to white to green as Agent Vega read his rights. Amanda was sobbing, not from sadness, but from the horrific realization that her entire marriage was built on crimes she'd unknowingly benefited from. Several elderly church members were being helped to chairs by younger relatives who were trying to process the magnitude of what they'd witnessed. "Agent Vega," I said, stepping forward in my dress blues, "I have additional evidence that supports the charges." She nodded professionally. "Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, we'll need you to come to the field office tomorrow morning for a complete debriefing. Your documentation has been invaluable to this investigation." As the FBI team escorted Jake from the fellowship hall in handcuffs, he turned back to look at me one final time. The hatred in his eyes was pure and undiluted, but underneath it was something else, a grudging recognition that he'd been outmaneuvered by someone he'd underestimated for 15 years. "This isn't over," he said, the same threat that criminals always make when they've been caught. "Yes, it is," I replied quietly. "It's been over since the moment you decided to steal from veterans and poison your own mother. You just didn't know it yet." The aftermath of Jake's arrest consumed the next 6 months of my life. The federal investigation expanded far beyond Jake's individual crimes, uncovering a network of elder abuse and financial fraud that reached across Texas and into 3 neighboring states. Jake hadn't been working alone. He'd been part of a loosely organized group of family members and caregivers who specialized in exploiting elderly relatives and veterans' benefits.
The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Over 40 families had been victimized, with total losses exceeding $3.2 million. Jake had been one of the more sophisticated operators, but he was far from the only one systematically looting his own family's resources while presenting himself as a devoted caregiver. Agent Vega kept me informed throughout the investigation, partly because my evidence had been crucial to building the case, and partly because several other victims had military connections that required coordination with VA investigators. What emerged was a pattern of predatory behavior targeting families with military members, exploiting the trust and financial support that veterans typically provided to their relatives. "Your brother was particularly skilled at the psychological manipulation aspect," Agent Vega explained during one of our debriefing sessions. He'd identified that military families often feel guilty about deployments and separations, and he exploited that guilt to justify his crimes. The trial, when it finally came, was a media sensation that put Millfield, Texas on the national map for all the wrong reasons. Jake had become the poster child for elder abuse and veterans exploitation, his case studied by law enforcement agencies across the country as an example of how sophisticated these schemes could become. Jake's defense team tried every strategy imaginable. They claimed he was the victim of a vindictive sister seeking revenge for childhood grievances. They argued that his elderly parents had given him permission to manage their finances and make decisions on their behalf. They suggested that I had manufactured evidence and manipulated recordings to frame an innocent man. None of it worked. The evidence was too overwhelming, the paper trail too detailed, the recorded admissions too damning. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 23 counts. Judge Patricia Harrison, a former military prosecutor who specialized in veterans issues, delivered a sentence that sent shockwaves through the elder abuse community. 35 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole, plus restitution of $1.7 million to the various victims Jake had defrauded over the years. "Mr. Mitchell," Judge Harrison said during sentencing, "you have committed some of the most despicable crimes that can be imagined. Betraying the trust of your own parents while they were vulnerable, stealing money intended to support veterans and their families, and systematically destroying the lives of people who loved you. Your actions represent not just criminal behavior, but a fundamental corruption of the values that military families hold sacred."
But the legal victory, satisfying as it was, couldn't undo the damage Jake had inflicted on our family. Dad was gone, his final months poisoned by the stress of discovering his son's betrayal. Mom's health had deteriorated significantly during the investigation, accelerated by Jake's medication tampering and the trauma of learning the truth about her trusted caregiver. More heartbreakingly, I'd discovered letters Dad had written during his final weeks, letters expressing his regret for doubting my commitment to family and his pride in my military service. Jake's manipulation had worked so well that Dad had died believing I cared more about my career than my family, never knowing that I'd been sending money home for years and investigating Jake's crimes to protect him. "I was wrong about Sarah," one letter read. "Jake convinced me she'd become selfish and distant, but I'm starting to see that maybe Jake has his own reasons for wanting me to think badly of her. I wish I could talk to her directly, but Jake says she's too busy to deal with family problems. Maybe I should call anyway." Dad never made that call. Jake had intercepted his phone attempts and convinced him that I was avoiding family contact because I was embarrassed by their financial struggles. Dad had died thinking his daughter didn't care about him, while his son was actively stealing the money I was sending to support his care. The financial recovery process took years. Federal asset forfeiture had seized Jake's house, boat, and other major purchases, but much of the stolen money had been dissipated through his lavish lifestyle. The hardware store was bankrupt, destroyed by years of Jake's mismanagement and theft. Mom's medical bills had consumed most of her remaining assets, and her life insurance policy, which Jake had increased without her knowledge, became the subject of a lengthy legal battle. But the most significant recovery wasn't financial, it was personal. The investigation had revealed the true extent of my financial support for the family over the years. Documentation that proved I'd been the primary source of funds for Dad's medical care, Mom's therapy, and household expenses. The narrative Jake had constructed about me being selfish and absent was thoroughly demolished by bank records, money transfer receipts, and power of attorney documents I'd legitimately signed. The community response was complex and evolved over time. Initially, many people were simply shocked that someone they'd known and trusted for years could commit such sophisticated crimes. Jake had been genuinely popular in Millfield, active in community organizations, and apparently devoted to his family. The revelation that his entire public persona had been a carefully crafted lie was difficult for people to process. But as more details emerged during the trial, public opinion shifted decisively. People began remembering incidents that seemed innocent at the time, but took on sinister meanings in light of Jake's crimes. The times he'd discouraged visitors from spending too much time with Dad during his illness. The way he'd always had explanations for why Mom couldn't come to social events or family gatherings. The financial difficulties he'd blamed on economic conditions or business competition, when he'd actually been stealing the profits for personal use. Mrs. Henderson, who'd praised Jake's devotion at the funeral viewing, became one of his harshest critics. He looked me in the eye and lied for years, made me feel sorry for him, made me criticize Sarah for not being around enough. I'm ashamed of how easily he fooled us.
During that memorial service, Colonel Peterson delivered a eulogy that captured the tragedy of Jake's crimes better than any legal proceeding could have. Master Sergeant Daniel Mitchell served his country with honor for 22 years, Colonel Peterson said. But his greatest service was raising a daughter who inherited his values and his commitment to protecting others. Sarah Mitchell didn't just serve 4 combat tours. She spent 15 years protecting her family from a predator they couldn't see. Her father would be proud of the soldier she became and the justice she delivered. The investigation also revealed how many other families had been victimized by similar schemes. My case became a catalyst for legislative changes in Texas elder abuse laws and veterans' benefits protections. The Mitchell Act, passed unanimously by the Texas legislature, created stronger penalties for family members who exploit elderly relatives and established better oversight mechanisms for caregivers with access to veterans' benefits. I testified before congressional subcommittees on veterans affairs and elder abuse, sharing my family's story to help other military families recognize warning signs of financial exploitation. The experience was painful but necessary. Too many veterans were sending money home to support family members without realizing their generosity was being systematically stolen. Military families are particularly vulnerable to this type of exploitation, I testified, because we're often physically separated from our relatives and dependent on family members for information about care needs and financial situations. The trust we place in family caregivers can be weaponized by predators who understand how to manipulate military culture and values. The personal healing took longer than the legal proceedings. I'd spent 15 years believing that my military service had somehow disappointed my father, that my deployments had made me less valuable to my family than Jake's presence at home. Learning the truth, that Dad had been proud of my service and that Jake had systematically poisoned our relationship, was liberating but also devastating. I took early retirement from the Army in 2024 at 21 years of service to focus on caring for Mom and rebuilding the family relationships that Jake had damaged through his manipulations. Mom's condition had stabilized once Jake's medication tampering ended, and she was able to communicate more clearly than anyone had realized. "I always knew," she whispered to me during one of our conversations, her speech slow but clear. "Something wrong with Jake. Scared to say anything. He controlled everything." Mom had been aware of Jake's manipulation and abuse, but had been too frightened and isolated to seek help. Jake had convinced her that no one would believe her concerns, that questioning his care would result in her being placed in a nursing home where she wouldn't see family anymore. She'd endured years of increasing control and medication errors because she'd been terrorized into silence. But with Jake gone and his control removed, Mom began to recover some of her cognitive function and independence. We moved her back into the family home, hired legitimate caregivers who respected her autonomy, and worked to rebuild the relationship that Jake had tried to destroy through isolation and manipulation. The hardware store was gone, liquidated to pay Jake's debts and provide restitution to his victims, but the insurance settlement and asset recovery eventually provided enough money to secure Mom's long-term care and maintain her independence. More importantly, she was no longer living in fear of the person who was supposed to protect her. I established the Daniel Mitchell Foundation in 2025, using my military pension and speaking fees from congressional testimony to create resources for military families dealing with elder abuse and financial exploitation. The foundation provides legal assistance, financial counseling, and advocacy services for veterans whose family members have been victimized by caregivers or relatives. The work is deeply personal, but also strategically important. Every family we help represents a victory over predators like Jake, who exploit military values of loyalty and trust. Every case we expose helps other families recognize warning signs before they become victims. Amanda divorced Jake while he was awaiting trial, taking their 2 young children and moving across the country to start over with a new identity. She'd been genuinely ignorant of Jake's crimes, but the association with his case had made it impossible for her to remain in Texas. Before she left, she visited me to apologize for the years she'd unknowingly benefited from his theft. She said, "We thought we were just lucky," she said, crying as she spoke. "The house, the vacations, Jake's generosity with gifts and trips. I never questioned where the money came from because he always had explanations that sounded reasonable." I didn't blame Amanda. She'd been another victim of Jake's manipulation, used as cover for his crimes and discarded when his schemes collapsed. Her children would grow up without their father, another cost of Jake's selfishness and greed. Today, 3 years after that confrontation in the fellowship hall, I live in a small house near Mom's care facility in Austin. I work with the foundation, testify in elder abuse cases, and help other military families navigate the complex process of protecting vulnerable relatives from exploitation. Jake is serving his sentence at a federal prison in Colorado with no possibility of parole until he's 73 years old. He'll die in prison, which seems appropriate for someone who destroyed so many lives through his selfish crimes. I don't visit him, don't write to him, don't think about him, except when his case helps me protect other families from similar predators. The question Jake asked at Dad's funeral, "You think you're a hero?" has taken on a different meaning over the years. I'm not a hero in the traditional military sense. I didn't charge enemy positions or save wounded soldiers under fire. But I did something that might be more important. I protected my family from a predator who wore a familiar face, and I used my survival to protect other families from similar threats. Military service teaches you that heroism isn't always dramatic or public. Sometimes it's quietly gathering evidence while everyone thinks you're paranoid. Sometimes it's enduring years of character assassination while documenting crimes that seem too evil to be real. Sometimes it's standing in a church fellowship hall and telling the truth when lies would be easier. Jake thought my military service made me selfish and distant, unsuited for the complexities of family loyalty. What he didn't understand was that military service had taught me exactly the skills I needed to defeat him: strategic planning, attention to detail, patience under pressure, and the ability to see through deception to underlying truth. The little girl who'd watched her father serve with honor became a woman who understood that sometimes the most important battles are fought against enemies who claim to love you. The soldier who'd deployed 4 times to protect strangers learned that the most crucial mission might be protecting family members from the people closest to them. Dad's funeral was the end of Jake's war against my honor and service. But it was the beginning of my war against everyone like him, the predators who exploit military families, who weaponize love and trust, who destroy lives while presenting themselves as devoted caregivers. That war continues every day, through the foundation, through congressional testimony, through helping other families recognize the signs of financial exploitation before it's too late. It's a different kind of service than wearing the uniform, but it's service nonetheless. And Dad, wherever he is, finally knows the truth about both of his children, which one served with honor and which one betrayed everything he'd tried to teach us about integrity and family loyalty. Jake was wrong about me thinking I'm a hero, but he was right about one thing. I am a soldier, and soldiers protect the innocent from those who would harm them, even when the enemy wears your brother's face.